Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Race Rebels, Culture, Politics, and the Black Working Class by Robin D.G. Kelley, narrated by L. Malaika Cooper. Forward. It is getting hotter all the time on the streets of America's cities. 2 years after the most destructive civil insurrection in U.S. history, many things have changed and few things have improved. Homeless men, women, and children congregate on downtown streets or seek shelter in abandoned warehouses and factories. The seeming permanence of a low-wage, low-employment economy undermines morale in the present and curtails hope for the future. Racial antagonisms spark outbursts of hate, hurt, and fear in high schools, in shopping centers, and on the streets themselves. An entire generation of young people can see that they are society's lowest priority, that they have been allocated the very worst in education, healthcare, transportation, and social services, that they are unwanted as workers, as students, as citizens, or sometimes even as consumers. At the same time, there is a powerful and almost desperate desire for change. In schools and on street corners, in medical clinics and community centers, in places of work and places of worship, the verdict is in on the disaster created in this country by 20 years of neoconservative economics. Most people have suffered terribly from the systematic dismantling of the human and social capital of the United States that took place in the 1970s and 1980s, at the same time that taxpayer dollars went to subsidize the spending sprees and speculative schemes of a wealthy few. In organized protest, but more in embryonic cultural coalitions calling attention to the contradictions of our time, the contours of a new kind of social movement are starting to emerge. Things are moving very fast, but in opposite directions, oscillating between the renewed racism and class stratification of the 1970s and 1980s and the emergence of egalitarian, multi-issue, pan-ethnic, anti-racist coalitions. The present and the future are up for grabs in a way that happens rarely in history. Our problem is that we don't know enough about how egalitarian social change takes place, about how social movements start and how they succeed, about how people find the will to struggle and the way to win when they are facing forces far more powerful than themselves. Race Rebels arms us with what we need to know. It provides us with knowledge, with descriptions and analyses of what struggles for social change actually entail. Robin D.G. Kelley presents us with a picture of masses in motion, of people as they actually are rather than as others wish them to be. He shows that political activism can never be a perfect, pure, or non-contradictory endeavor, that it is messy and cannot be held in place by simple slogans suggested from the outside. Instead, Kelley looks to history to learn how we can make sense out of what is happening before our very eyes, how we can participate in a movement that speaks from people rather than for them, and that allows people to openly acknowledge the things that divide them, even as they rally together for common goals. In his discussion of Black working-class opposition to racism and exploitation, of fights over public space on Birmingham's public buses, of the relationship between the civil rights movement and the Black poor, of the currents of Black nationalism nurtured within the Communist Party, USA, and his positively brilliant and inspiring readings of rap music and the Zoot Suit as icons of opposition among aggrieved peoples. Kelley reads back to us the political truth of the lives we live. He shows how hard people have to fight to speak for themselves, to find spaces for action, and to defend the gains they've won. Furthermore, Kelley frames these lively, insightful, and subtle studies within a broader analysis that delineates the bankruptcy of prevailing social science theories about culture while pointing the way toward new ones. Race Rebels is a book for our time, a book that is on time, and a book that understands it is past time to face up to our responsibilities and to make the most of our opportunities. George Lipsitz, Department of Ethnic Studies, University of California at San Diego. Introduction. Writing Black working-class history from way, way below. Against this monster, people all over the world, and particularly ordinary working people in factories, mines, fields, and offices, are rebelling every day in ways of their own invention. Sometimes their struggles are on a small personal scale. Always the aim is to regain control over their own conditions of life and their relations with one another. Their strivings have few chroniclers. They themselves are constantly attempting various forms of organization, uncertain of where the struggle is going to end. C.L.R. James, Grace C. Lee, and Pierre Chalieu. Facing Reality. McDonald's is a happy place. I really believed that slogan when I began working there in 1978. For many of us employed at the Central Pasadena franchise, Mickey D's actually meant food, folks, and fun, though our main objective was funds. Don't get me wrong, the work was tiring and the polyester uniforms unbearable. The swing managers who made slightly more than the rank and file were constantly on our ass to move fast and smile more frequently. The customers treated us as if we were stupid, probably because 90% of the employees at our franchise were African Americans or Chicanos from poor families. But we found inventive ways to compensate. Like virtually all of my fellow workers, I liberated McDonaldland cookies by the boxful, volunteered to clean lots and lobbies in order to talk to my friends, and accidentally cooked too many quarter-pounders and apple pies near closing time, knowing fully well that we could take home whatever was left over. Sometimes we misused the available technology to our advantage. Back in our day, the shakes did not come ready mixed. We had to pour the frozen shake mix from the shake machine into a paper cup, add flavored syrup, and place it on an electric blender for a couple of minutes. If it was not attached correctly, the mixer blade would cut the sides of the cup and cause a disaster. While these mishaps slowed us down and created a mess to clean up, anyone with an extra cup handy got a little shake out of it. Because we were underpaid and overworked, we accepted consumption as just compensation, though in hindsight, eating Big Macs and fries to make up for low wages and mistreatment was probably closer to self-flagellation. That we were part of the working class, engaged in workplace struggles, never crossed our minds, in part because the battles that were dear to most of us and the strategies we adopted fell outside the parameters of what most people think of as traditional labor disputes. I've never known anyone at our McDonald's to argue about wages. Rather, some of us occasionally asked our friends to punch our time cards before we arrived, especially if we were running late. And no one, to my knowledge, demanded that management extend our break. We simply operated on CP, colored people's time, turning 15 minutes into 25. What we fought over were more important things like what radio station to play. The owner and some of the managers felt bound to easy listening. We turned to stations like K-Day on AM or KJLH and K-Ace on the FM dial so we could rock to the funky sounds of Rick James, Parliament, Heatwave, the Ohio Players, and yes, Michael Jackson. Hair was perhaps the most contested battleground. Those of us without closely cropped cuts were expected to wear hairnets, and we were simply not having it. Of course, the kids who identified with the Black and Chicano gangs of the late 70s had no problem with this rule since they wore hairnets all the time. But to net one's jerry curl, a lingering afro, A freshly permed do was outrageous. We fought those battles with amazing tenacity, and won most of the time. We even attempted to alter our ugly uniforms by opening buttons, wearing our hats tilted to the side, rolling up our sleeves a certain way, or adding a variety of different accessories. Nothing was sacred, not even the labor process. We undoubtedly had our share of slowdowns and deliberate acts of carelessness, but what I remember most was the way many of us stylized our work. We ignored the films and manuals and turned work into performance. Women on the cash register maneuvered effortlessly with long, carefully manicured nails and forefinger rings. Tossing trash became an opportunity to try out our best Dr. J moves. The brothers who worked the grill, it was only brothers from what I recall, were far more concerned with looking cool than ensuring an equal distribution of reconstituted onions on each all-beef patty. Just imagine a young black male, gangsta limping, between the toaster and the grill, brandishing a spatula like a walking stick or a microphone. And while all of this was going on, folks were signifying on one another, talking loudly about each other's mamas, daddies, boyfriends, girlfriends, automobiles, or lack thereof, breath, skin color, uniforms, on occasion, describing in hilarious detail the peculiarities of customers standing on the other side of the counter. Such chatter often drew in the customers, who found themselves entertained or offended, or both, by our verbal circus and collective dialogues. The employees at the Central Pasadena McDonald's were constantly inventing new ways to rebel, ways rooted in our own peculiar circumstances. And we never knew where the struggle would end. Indeed, I doubt any of us thought we were part of a movement that even had an end other than punching out a time card. Though I do think the taylorizing of McDonald's, the introduction of new technology to make service simpler and more efficient, has a lot to do with management's struggle to minimize these acts of resistance and recreation. But what we fought for is a crucial part of the overall story. The terrain was often cultural, centering on identity, dignity, and fun. We tried to turn work into pleasure, to turn our bodies into instruments of pleasure. Generational and cultural specificity had a good deal to do with our unique forms of resistance, but a lot of our actions were linked directly to the labor process, gender conventions, and our class status. Like most working people throughout the world, my fellow employees at Mickey D's were neither total victims of routinization, exploitation, sexism, and racism, nor were they rational economic beings driven by the most base utilitarian concerns. Their lives and struggles were so much more complicated. If we are to make meaning of these kinds of actions rather than dismiss them as manifestations of immaturity, false consciousness, or primitive rebellion, we must begin to dig beneath the surface of trade union pronouncements, political institutions, and organized social movements, deep into the daily lives, cultures, and communities which make the working classes so much more than people who work. We have to step into the complicated maze of experience that renders ordinary folks so extraordinarily multifaceted, diverse, and complicated. Most importantly, we need to break away from traditional notions of politics. We must not only redefine what is political, but question a lot of common ideas about what are authentic movements and strategies of resistance. By authentic, I mean the assumption that only certain organizations and ideologies can truly represent particular group interests. E.g., workers' struggles must be located within labor organizations, or African American concerns are most clearly articulated in so-called mainstream civil rights organizations such as the NAACP or the Urban League. Such an approach not only disregards diversity and conflict within groups, but it presumes that the only struggles that count take place through institutions. If we are going to write a history of Black working class resistance, where do we place the vast majority of people who did not belong to either working class organizations or Black political movements? A lot of Black working people struggled and survived without direct links to the kinds of organizations that dominate historical accounts of African American or U.S. working class resistance. The so-called margins of struggle, whether it is the unorganized, often spontaneous battles with authority or social movements thought to be inauthentic or unrepresentative of the community's interests, are really a fundamental part of the larger story waiting to be told. Race Rebels begins to recover and explore aspects of Black working class life and politics that have been relegated to the margins. By focusing on the daily lives of African American working people, strategies of resistance and survival, expressive cultures, and their involvement in radical political movements, this book attempts to chronicle the inventive and diverse struggles waged by Black workers during the 20th century and to understand what they mean for rethinking the way we construct the political, social, and cultural history of the United States. I chose the title Race Rebels because this book looks at forms of resistance, organized and unorganized, that have remained outside of, and even critical of, what we've come to understand as the key figures and institutions in African American politics. The historical actors I write about are literally race rebels, and thus have been largely ignored by chroniclers of Black politics and labor activism. Secondly, the title points to the centrality of race in the minds and experiences of African Americans. Race, particularly a sense of Blackness, not only figures prominently in the collective identities of Black working people, but substantially shapes the entire nation's conceptions of class and gender. Part of what Race Rebels explores is the extent to which Black working people struggle to maintain and define a sense of racial identity and solidarity. Some of the questions Race Rebels takes up have their roots in works by an older generation of radical scholars who chose to study slavery and its demise when fascism was on the rise in Europe and the future of colonialism was uncertain. The two most influential books in this respect were written nearly 3 decades before E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, namely W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, 1935, and C.L.R. James's Study of the Haitian Revolution, titled Black Jacobins, 1938. These majestic histories of revolution, resistance, and the making of new working classes out of the destruction of slavery anticipated the new social historians' efforts to write history from below. They also contributed enormously to revising the history of Western revolutions by placing race, culture, and the agency of African people, the slaves and ex-slaves, at the center of the story. Neither author viewed the newly created Black proletariat as merely passive products of economic exploitation and dislocation. In Du Bois's account, freed people are on the move, undermining slavery at every halting step. The men and women who fought to reconstruct the South were more than servants and cotton pickers. They were Negroes with a capital N. They belonged to families and churches, and they brought with them a powerful millenarian vision of fairness and equality. And the white poor who supported efforts to stop them, the folks whose most valuable possession was probably their skin, put the noose around their own neck in exchange for membership in the white race. Black Reconstruction may still be the most powerful reminder of how fundamental race is for understanding American culture and politics. For C.L.R. James, the slaves' memories of Africa, the world they created in the quarters bordering the cane fields, the social meaning ascribed to skin color, the cultural and religious conflicts within African-descended communities, were as critical to creating and shaping the revolution as were backbreaking labor and the lash. The New Labor, or New Social historians, who set out to write history from below in the early to mid-1960s, traveled even further down the road opened up by their predecessors. Unlike Du Bois and James, whose work on Black labor entered the scholarly world either quietly or amid vehement opposition, this new generation of historians caused a revolution. The story of its origins is so familiar that it may one day be added to the New Testament. The late E.P. Thompson was the Moses of it all, along with his British ex-communist comrades and fellow travelers like Eric Hobsbawm, and Africanists like Terence Ranger. Across the Channel were prophets like George Roudet, and across the Atlantic were disciples like Herbert Goodman, David Montgomery, Eugene Genovese, and so on. They differed in time, place, and subject matter, but they all shared the radical belief that one could, indeed, write history from below. Of course, there were those critics who felt the new genre failed to take on the state or ignored political economy. And for all of its radical moorings, history from below started out very manly and very white, or at least Euro-ethnic, though that changed somewhat with the emergence of women's and ethnic studies. Yet, as old as the new labor history is, history from below, in its heyday, had a very small impact on the study of African Americans. Certainly, there are those who might argue that all Black history is from below, so to speak, since African Americans are primarily a working-class population. This view has its problems, however. Aside from the fact that every racial or ethnic group in the United States was primarily working class, it denies or minimizes diversity and conflict within African American communities. Unable to see a world that left few written records, many scholars concerned with studying race relations folded the Black working class into a very limited and at times monolithic definition of the Black community. By overlooking or playing down class and gender differences, mainstream middle-class male leaders have too often been regarded as, in historian Nell Painter's words, representative colored men. The chapters in Part 1 not only question whether a handful of representative Negroes can speak for the mass of working-class African Americans, but also suggest that some of the most dynamic struggles take place outside, indeed, sometimes in spite of, established organizations and institutions. All 4 chapters explore the political significance of everyday forms of resistance at work and in public space, the pleasures and politics of culture and community institutions that are usually not defined as working-class organizations. In other words, I sought to dig a little deeper beneath below, to those workers whose record of resistance and survival is far more elusive. I'm referring here to evasive, day-to-day strategies, from foot-dragging to sabotage, theft at the workplace to absenteeism, cursing to graffiti. These chapters also explore the double-edged sword of race in the South, which is why I call Part 1, We Wear the Mask, from Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem of the same title. The mask of grins and lies enhanced Black working people's invisibility and enabled them to wage a kind of underground guerrilla battle with their employers, the police, and other representatives of the status quo. Although the South certainly had its share of militant African American and interracial movements, and the status quo was sufficiently afraid of rebellion to expend a tremendous amount of resources on keeping the peace and surveying Black communities, the mask worked precisely because most Southern whites accepted their own racial mythology. They believed that darkies were happy and content, and that any open, collective acts of defiance were probably inspired from the outside. On the other hand, the mask, exacted a price from Black folks as well. The inner pain generated by having to choke back one's feelings in the face of racism could create tensions. Writer Gloria Wade Gales, who grew up in a Memphis housing project and came of age on the eve of the civil rights movement, beautifully captured this dilemma. As teenagers, many of us were caught between our anger at white people and our respect for our Black elders, between a need to vent our rage in the light of day and a desire to remain alive, and between two images of our people, one for downtown and the other for ourselves. As I suggest in my discussion of Black resistance during World War II and during the Civil Rights Movement, the mask was no longer viable. Evasive strategies continued, to be sure, but often with a militant face. No matter what we might think about the grins and lies, the evasive tactics, the tiny acts of rebellion and survival, the reality is that most Black working-class resistance has remained unorganized, clandestine, and evasive. The driving questions that run through this book include: how do African American working people struggle and survive outside of established organizations or organized social movements? What impact do these daily conflicts and hidden concerns have on movements that purport to speak for the dispossessed? Can we call this politics? History from Below clearly pushed me to explore the politics of the everyday. The approach I take is deeply influenced by scholars who work on South Asia, especially political anthropologist James C. Scott. Scott maintains that, despite appearances of consent, oppressed groups challenge those in power by constructing a hidden transcript, a dissident political culture that manifests itself in daily conversations, folklore, jokes, songs, and other cultural practices. One also finds the hidden transcript emerging on stage in spaces controlled by the powerful, though almost always in disguised forms. The veiled social and cultural worlds of oppressed people frequently surface in everyday forms of resistance: theft, foot-dragging, the destruction of property, or, more rarely, in open attacks on individuals, institutions, or symbols of domination. Together, the hidden transcripts, created in aggrieved communities and expressed through culture, and the daily acts of resistance and survival constitute what Scott calls infra-politics. As he puts it, the circumspect struggle waged daily by subordinate groups is, like infrared rays, beyond the visible end of the spectrum. That it should be invisible is in large part by design, a tactical choice born of a prudent awareness of the balance of power. Like Scott, I use the concept of infrapolitics to describe the daily confrontations, evasive actions, and stifled thoughts that often inform organized political movements. I am not suggesting that the realm of infrapolitics is any more or less important or effective than what we traditionally understand to be politics. Instead, I want to suggest that the political history of oppressed people cannot be understood without reference to infrapolitics, for these daily acts have a cumulative effect on power relations. While the meaning and effectiveness of various acts differ according to the particular circumstances, they do make a difference, whether intended or not. One measure of the power and historical importance of the informal infrapolitics of the oppressed is the response of those who dominate traditional politics. Daily acts of resistance and survival have had consequences for existing power relations, and the powerful have deployed immense resources in order to avoid those consequences or to punish transgressors. Knowing how those in power interpret, redefine, and respond to the thoughts and actions of the oppressed is just as important as identifying and analyzing resistance. The policies, strategies, or symbolic representations of those in power, what Scott calls the official or public transcript cannot be understood without examining the infrapolitics of oppressed groups.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?